All right, let's just jump right into this explainer, shall we? Today, we're tracking an incredible 10-year runaway train of ambition that literally redefined the ancient world. We're talking about a guy whose very name is synonymous with conquest, whose life was just so breathtakingly intense that it fundamentally altered the course of human history.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this history, you've got to look at the nearly impossible odds he started with. I mean, picture this. At 20 years old, this conqueror inherits a rugged, mountainous kingdom that all the sophisticated Greeks down south viewed as just a backwater. But by 30, his empire stretched from Greece all the way to modern-day Pakistan. It is an absolutely astonishing 10-year campaign that pushed him to the very edge of the known world.
Which brings us to part 1, the foundation, specifically the Macedonian war machine.
Because here's the thing, before he could even think about crossing into Asia to take on the mighty Persian Empire, Alexander needed the ultimate weapon. He didn't just stumble into greatness, he actually inherited a perfectly tuned machine built by his father, King Philip II. This is the tactical evolution right here that made the Macedonian Phalanx an unstoppable wall of iron. Look at the traditional Greek hoplite, sturdy, dependable, wielding an 8-foot spear. Solid, right? But Philip's game-changer was the Macedonian phalangite holding the sarissa. That's an 18-foot pike. Just imagine charging into battle holding a weapon the height of a full-grown giraffe. Packed 16 ranks deep, it completely changed the geometry of ancient warfare. And Alexander treated this perfectly balanced force, about 40,000 men total, like literal chess pieces to pull off these lightning-fast shock-and-awe strategies. The phalanx was an absolute powerhouse, sure, but it was vulnerable on its sides. So what does he do? He uses 3,000 elite hypaspes to guard those vulnerable flanks. He brings in these expert Agrians, javelin throwers for skirmishing. And then the crown jewel, the companion cavalry. These 1,800 elite horsemen were his shock troops, led personally by Alexander himself, designed to deliver the absolute knockout blow.
Moving on to Part 2, the Impossible War, crossing into the Persian Empire.
So it's 334 BC. And our 20-year-old king crosses the Hellespont, plunging headfirst into a massive, heavily resourced Persian Empire that is fully prepped to crush him. Take the Battle of Issus. He gets trapped by an army estimated at a staggering 100,000 strong. He's outnumbered almost 2-to-1 on this narrow, 6-mile plain. But here's the crazy part. That narrow battlefield wedged between the mountains and the sea, it actually prevented the Persian king Darius III from fully exploiting his massive numerical advantage.
And you have to understand, Alexander's leadership was fearless. Honestly, it was almost reckless. He wasn't sitting safely in a command tent. He was right out there fighting in the chaotic, bloody front line. In an earlier fight at the Granicus River, his headlong cavalry charge very nearly got him killed. A Persian noble literally shattered Alexander's helmet with a sword, and right as another guy raised his blade to finish the job, Alexander's general, Black Cletus, swoops in and completely severs the attacker's arm. I mean, this is a ruler who literally, physically bled with his men. But we also can't ignore the visceral, human cost of those lightning-fast cavalry charges. It was absolutely staggering. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's own commanders, painted this horrific picture of ancient combat. He noted that the fleeing Persians were slaughtered in such a brutal massacre that the dead were actually used to fill a deep ravine just so the army could cross over it. Once the Persian line broke, the pursuit was just relentless.
That brings us to Part 3, Breaking an Empire, the tactical masterpiece at Gaugamela.
Fast forward a bit to 331 BC, and Alexander is facing the ultimate showdown. Darius has assembled an even larger army. We're talking scythed chariots, war elephants, the whole shebang, right on flat, open ground. But Alexander's sheer tactical brilliance turned being heavily outnumbered into an actual advantage. He intentionally dragged his right wing wide, pulling the Persian flank out with him. Darius, who is terrified of being encircled, shifts his center over to compensate, and the very second that center stretched and weakened, boom, Alexander saw his opening. He led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight into that gap, charging right at Darius himself, which caused the Persian king to turn his chariot and completely flee in panic.
So, with the Persian army shattered and Darius on the run, Alexander seizes the royal treasuries, and then he controversially burns down the ceremonial capital in a highly dramatic act of vengeance. Entering Persepolis in 330 BC, he initially tries to play the part of the liberator, but soon after, he orders the entire city torched. It was direct retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens' sacred temples over a century earlier. It's this really stark reminder of the dark side of ambition, right? Where liberation can just quickly devolve into ruthless revenge.
Let's look at part 4, the breaking point, hubris and the edge of the world. So, the external war, that was largely won, but the internal collapse was really just getting started. Alexander began adopting Persian dress and demanding a traditional ritual called proskynesis, which basically meant prostrating yourself before the king. Now, this caused a massive cultural rift with the Macedonian veterans who had been fighting with him for years. To the conquered Persians, bowing down was just standard respect, but to the Greeks, a king was simply a first among equals. Bowing like that was an act reserved strictly for the gods. By forcing this issue, Alexander crossed a really dangerous line into absolute hubris. And from there, his inner circle quickly devolved into a dark, incredibly dangerous reality. The very men who won him this massive empire were systematically eliminated. Philotas and his veteran father Parmenion, these were crucial commanders at literally all his major battles. They were executed over a rumored plot. Then, incredibly, in a drunken fury, Alexander murdered Clytus the Black. Yes, the exact same guy who saved his life at Granicus. The royal court had basically turned into a lethal snake pit.
Pushing his exhausted army over the Hindu Kush mountains and down into India to fight war elephants finally brought his forces to their absolute breaking point at the river Hyphasis. Think about it. They had followed him to the literal ends of the earth, fought off relentless guerrilla attacks, and suffered tremendous casualties. It's a profound lesson in the limits of human endurance, because even the greatest, most disciplined armies in human history will eventually hit a wall of absolute burnout.
Faced with terrifying rumors of gigantic Indian armies waiting ahead and just suffering from endless marching in alien environments, the troops mutinied. They simply refused to take another step, forcing a furious Alexander to finally turn back. That unstoppable wall of spears that had conquered the known world, it just stopped moving. The most powerful man on earth was essentially forced into a timeout, sulking in his tent. But the reality was unavoidable. The great conquest was officially over.
Which leaves us to part 5, the final campaign, the Echoes of Empire.
You know, the return journey was definitely not some glorious victory lap. It was a devastating crawl. Instead of a triumphant parade, the march back west became a brutal struggle for survival that fractured his command even further. First, Alexander was dangerously wounded in the chest while personally leading an assault against the Mahalians. Then, he decided to march a portion of his army right through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert. The extreme heat and total lack of water led to terrible suffering, taking the lives of thousands of his own soldiers in what was, frankly, an entirely avoidable catastrophe.
Upon his return, he desperately tried to fuse his newly fractured empire back together through some pretty drastic cultural integrations. He organized this massive, magnificent marriage ceremony in Susa to literally wed the two cultures together, and he even ordered 30,000 Persian youths to be trained up in the Macedonian Phalanx style. But to his grizzled veterans, this just looked like their king was actively replacing them. They felt totally discarded, which actually sparked yet another rebellion at Opis that Alexander had to suppress.
Finally, we find him in Babylon. While planning his next massive campaign down into Arabia, Alexander developed a sudden fever. Now, whether it was malaria, typhus, or even poison, we don't know for sure. But the ancient world's brightest, most destructive comet burned out incredibly abruptly. He died undefeated in battle at just 32 years old.
Because he left absolutely no clear succession plan, his generals immediately tore the empire apart. It triggered a brutal power struggle that even saw the murder of his own wife, Roxana, and his young son. The sprawling empire he spent 10 frantic years building couldn't even outlast him by a few days. It was simply too vast, way too unstable, and relied entirely on the sheer gravity of his own unmatched persona.
So, as Greek ideas spread across his former territories, fusing with local traditions to trigger these incredible new developments in art, science, and government, we are left with the really profound dilemma. We have to look back at the countless dead, the scorched cities, and the broken armies, and ask ourselves this. If the glorious legacy of the Hellenistic Age was built on a foundation of endless violence and unyielding ambition, was it truly worth the price?